Welcome all to the Women in Architecture Vancouver Pechakucha style event. We are quite excited about the event we have lined up for you this evening. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land from where we are joining you tonight is the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We are happy to have you all here tonight with us virtually, especially those attending their first Women in Architecture event. Change slides here. My name is Emily Rankin, and I'm a volunteer with WIA Vancouver. It took the efforts of many volunteers to produce this event this evening. Thank you very, very much to everyone for all of this work and to the presenters who are also volunteering their time for us this evening. Thank you. WIA Vancouver is always looking for more volunteers. On our website, we have positions available on programming and communications committees. Putting on events takes a lot of work, and we are always looking for more help. If you are interested, please email us through the WIA Vancouver website. If you are not already on our list and would like to be to follow our future events, please follow the link on our website, wiavancouver.org, and whitelist our email address, info@wiavancouver.org, for newsletters, reminders, and special events. Also, this event is approved for 1.5 AIBC learning units. For credit, please put your full name and AIBC number in the chat to hosts, and we will submit to the AIBC on your behalf. Also, if you are looking for IDIBC credits, same thing, please put your name in the chat and we can submit for credits on your behalf. WIA's mission is to champion women in architecture and related professions by celebrating their achievements and providing opportunities for career development, networking, advocacy, and inspiration for women at all career levels. Tonight's event is about just that. The event will consist of a series of 8 different presenters sharing a slide deck of 20 slides each for approximately 20 seconds per slide, with time at the end for questions from our audience. The event is meant to be casual and supportive and hopefully fuel conversation beyond just this evening. For the Q&A that will happen close to the end of the event, you can use the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please direct questions to a specific presenter. You can enter questions throughout the evening, and we will have a session at the end of all the presentations for Jessica to facilitate a Q&A with all of our speakers. So without any more delay, I would like to introduce our first presenter. We have Narjes, Nadi, Miri, Principal Architect at M+ Architecture and Interior Design. Go ahead.
Hello everyone, and thanks for having me here tonight. I started practice of architecture 7 years ago, and I had this vision that this practice, similar to this light fixture, is going to be rosy, colorful, clear, and fun. During these years, I learned that we constantly need to be connected to a power source of knowledge, precision, and intense dedication. This path is an ongoing uphill, and it's not easy. But every now and then, I learn to step back, pause, and enjoy the spaces that we have created, and trying to remember those moments that we started a design from a napkin sketch and see the transformation into a memorable space. That light fixture is installed in this single family house, one of our early projects. Next project is a gathering hall, a meeting room located in Quadra Island near Whiskey Point Resort, adjacent to a hotel. And we were inspired by the forest, by the nature, and we had no choice just to use heavy timber, stone, and looking at the harbor, we introduced lots of natural light with the glazing. Under planning definition, this building is considered an accessory building. And when I was designing this building, I was realized for us, this is way beyond an accessory building. This is the heart and soul of that resort. People get together to share memories, to celebrate, to make the friendship bonds stronger. And we had to bring more care and attention to this accessory building. And luckily, we had a full support of city staff when they were reviewing their application. Next project is one of our recent project is subdivision and rezoning of a larger lot, single family lots into smaller lots under the supported OCP in West Vancouver. The reason I chose this slide is when we were sent out the information to the neighbors, I received an email from a fellow architect who is happened to be one of the neighbors of this house. And in his email, he raised a very good items that I couldn't have known without being the resident of that area. And I realized, I go back and make some great changes based on his comments. And I realized that all of us, we owe our cities and neighbors and neighborhood to participate in such an event and be the voice of our neighbors and make the communities a better place to live in. I'm always grateful of that fellow architects. Next project is a two-story industrial building in Squamish. It's supposed to be a typical tilt-up boxy building, but I managed to convince the client to think out of the box and allow us to design differently. And now the project has not even started it's not into construction yet, but there is a lineup of different tenants that he couldn't even imagine to have, or attracting more high-tech companies that are interested to lease these spaces, which supports their branding and high-tech technology. This is this is a sample of one of our tenant improvement projects and interior design work, introducing earth tone, groundy color. This is supposed to be a spa and cosmetic clinic, and we hope that we can create a space that bring a cozy and zen feeling for whoever is going to have a treatment there. This project is a modular pre-fabrication house. The first module is already built and is located in Squamish and is ready to be shipped to Kelowna this summer. This is highly efficient, carefully detailed, very efficient in energy savings. And we are exploring, this is a 10 by 40 foot module and will fit into a container and is ready to be shipped, and everything is going to be pre-finished and just services will be connected at the site. We explore different options for the client, and he's looking for a development for to accommodate vacation homes and short rental housings. And this project, it was a marathon of the design. They say that God created the world in 7 days. I'm not sure which one is more challenging. We completed design package for this project in 7 days. The bylaw was changing and becoming effective in a couple of weeks, and client just realized it's so late. He approached us and we pushed the entire team and the entire consultant to complete the entire permit package in designing in 7 days and another 7 days work with consultant. This was a marathon, but we're all happy that we are in the queue right now. And this is another sample of our tenant improvement project. We recently are getting lots of dental offices in Lower Mainland and the island. This is one of them. This is a facelift to a building as well as a tenant improvement for a lawyer's office. We are introducing aluminum cladding and wood to the building. And this is another facelift to a building, a brick building. We are introducing one tone of color to the entire brick as a background, as a dark canvas, and introducing custom perforated metal panels. This is a night shot. And this project is Little Kitchen Academy, just completed a couple of weeks ago. It's a cooking school for kids, and a lady who's operating this business, she was impressed and basically surprised that practice of architecture is very different than what she was imagining. It requires lots of administration and coordination from early stages of the design to the final day till we get the final inspection and occupancy permit. And I just like to thank my support team. These beautiful ladies are my angels. I could have not be anywhere close to where I'm standing now. We got this picture in front of Arthur Exum building, and I don't remember what was the topic that we were laughing so hard, but that day we had a blast. And although this journey is tough and ongoing uphill, every now and then we get a chance to pause and have fun together. I just want to thank this beautiful lady and all the women in architecture who have helped me to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Narjes. Up next, we have Autumn Sweet, the Associate Director of Planning and Design and Architect for Surrey Schools Capital Projects.
Okay, it's gonna share and go into presentation mode. Okay, everyone can see that? Okay, so I've been designing schools for 15 years. First in the private sector, then I moved to the Surrey School District's Capital Project Office, or the dark side, as my previous employer would call it in 2018. My current role is Associate Director of Planning and Design, and I essentially obtain funding from the province for the design and construction of new schools and additions. So what am I working on? Well, let me tell you lots of stuff. The Surrey School District is the largest school district in Canada with over 70,000 students. When the Ministry of Education approves a project from our capital plan, the Capital Project Office is then tasked with using taxpayers' money to service the community and, most importantly, the students. But it's not just the students that we're accountable to. We navigate ever-changing Ministry of Education initiatives, as well as provincial and municipal sustainable design targets. At the same time, we engage with a diverse number of stakeholders who have varying needs in how to deliver education in today's schools. Tonight, I'm going to show you examples of what I'm working on and how they address these three topics. The first topic is the Ministry of Education's initiatives, which is always changing. The most recent initiatives that have developed during my 3 years at the district is net zero energy schools and reduce greenhouse gas emission in schools. The first project is Tattaloo Elementary, and it was the first school in BC to have an option for net zero energy in a project definition report, which we call the PDR. So net zero energy means that the building will generate as much renewable energy on site as it consumes over a year. We held several workshops with our consultants to determine the most effective energy conservation measures, which include reducing air infiltration at the envelope and setting the air source heat pump to lower temperatures before the backup heat came on. With those energy conservation measures in place, the entire roof of the school would be covered in solar panels to offset the energy consumption of the school. Our modeling showed that the payback in energy savings was beyond the life of the measures we put in place. So in the end, it was the LEED Gold option that was approved by the ministry and not net zero energy. However, not to be deterred, we decided to switch gears and explore reducing our carbon footprint as much as we possibly could do within the approved budget. We're doing this by designing a compact building, implementing a composite mass timber structure, and moving away from gas-fired mechanical systems. Our energy model anticipates 6.6 tons of carbon will be produced, which is roughly half of what our older schools emit. Snoqualmie Elementary was the next school after Tattaloo that went into PDR stage. Now that the ministry learned that net zero energy was not feasible, they switched gears and mandated we had to have an option that lowers greenhouse gas emissions. This was the option that was approved for Snoqualmie, and it emits 0.7 tons of GHGs compared to the LEED Gold option, which is 6.6 tons. Both these schools are 3 stories and have a compact plan, which is not only for energy efficiency, but also a response to the site. Land is a commodity, and we're in constant race with developers to purchase land for schools where they're needed. The school district is forced to purchase smaller lots than previously, but we're building larger schools to accommodate the growth. Tataloo is located in a neighborhood that was made up of single-family lots. We were able to purchase 7 of them before the developers did. Snoqualmie, on the other hand, is in a very dense, established neighborhood, and we obtained the last 2 large lots in that area. This new way of thinking that schools need to go up rather than out has inspired us to rethink how we share amenities with the city, who we work very closely with. Surrey is a growing municipality and becoming more urban. With the future extension of the SkyTrain along Fraser Highway and the city revising their OCPs to include denser neighborhoods, we've started looking at building schools as part of a tower or in a city-run facility. There are already examples of this here in the Lower Mainland and across Canada. The other idea we're putting out there is developing our own school sites into campuses. Because we can't acquire land as quickly as developers can, we've been strategically looking at potential new sites that could accommodate 2 elementary schools on one site, or having both an elementary school and a secondary school share a site, or take over an existing larger elementary school site, build a secondary school on that site, then build the replacement elementary school on a different, smaller site, which isn't as easy as it sounds. Last March, the ministry approved a site purchase for a new high school in the Sullivan area, which is already dense and established. We looked at 3 potential sites, which we were unable to purchase. And so now we're starting to think outside the box. Do we build additions on all the surrounding high schools? Do we build on an existing elementary school site? Do we partner with a developer and obtain the land? Who knows? We are in constant flux. So once we have the land and approval to move into design, what happens? First, we retain several consultants, architects, and engineers. Then we establish a steering committee that consists of myself and the project manager, as well as several educators who may or may not be involved with the school when the project is complete. Part of my role is ensuring that design follows the Ministry of Education area standards, which were published in 2012, 10 years ago. Around 2015 is when BC updated its curriculum, making it more about inclusivity and collaboration. The 2012 area standards don't support this, and so we must get creative to give the educators the space they require to teach in. This often comes down to stealing, cheating, and lying to the ministry to get these spaces. We, as designers, encourage duplicity of space use. The ministry doesn't. Project space is valuable to educators and students today. These educators love these spaces because a lot of impromptu collaboration takes place, or younger kids see what the big kids are doing and it excites them. Those 2012 area standards don't have a provision for project space, so we borrow areas from other spaces such as classroom or special education to provide the school with what they need. Recently, we've been having a lot of discussion about the cultural impacts of combining male and female washrooms. On our addition projects that were pre-gender neutral washrooms, we provide gender neutral washrooms because the option for gendered washrooms already exists. On our new schools like Snoqualmie, we have a mix of gendered washrooms, gender neutral washrooms, and a variety of universal toilet rooms. We also actively engage with our Indigenous Learning Department. The head of that department sits on Snoqualmie's steering committee. One thing we learned from her was not having the principal's office right at the front door because it sends the message of surveillance, which can trigger traumatic memories for some of the members of our community. This sentiment was in keeping when during Tataloo's design, a principal on the steering committee wanted to move away from being in a surveillance position himself. So like I said earlier, I'm working on lots of stuff. And like any office, none of this great work would happen if it weren't for the amazing team we have at the district and the Capital Project Office. We're a very well-rounded, diverse group comprised of architects, engineers, construction specialists, interior designers, and administration support, who all bring a certain expertise and point of view to each project. Our days in the Capital Project Office are filled with chaos and laughter. You can't make up the stuff that we encounter on a daily basis. What we thought was new standard practice one day becomes obsolete the next, forcing us to think on our feet and roll with the punches. But in the end, we all pull together as a team and build beautiful spaces for the people who are most accountable to, the kids. I've literally become Edna Lovejoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Autumn. Up next, we have Carmen Cam, Sociability Research Assistant at Human Studio.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So hi everyone, my name is Carmen and I'm a Sociability Research Assistant at Human Studio. I'll be talking about fluid sociability, the sociability simulation tool we're developing, and architecture's impact on social connectivity. So why design for social connection? Socially connected communities are stronger in the way that they react to difficult situations like natural disasters, economic turndowns, and pandemics. They're better able to come together and kind of respond to those challenges as a whole, as a community. The built environment also plays a large role in the way we connect with our neighbors and the people around us. So we have a responsibility as designers to think of the quality of life and well-being when designing. So the benefits of social connection on an individual level, sociability can increase someone's happiness, improve mental and physical health. And there are studies done where patients with a strong support system are more likely to survive illnesses. On the flip side, social isolation and loneliness can contribute to a lower life expectancy, worsen your mental and physical health. And the health consequences of social isolation has also been linked to and compared to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So what needs to happen for a human interaction to occur? What needs to be set in place for someone to talk to someone else? People need to be in the public realm. So one of the general findings that we've gotten from Fluid is that the more time people spend outside of their private space, the more they are able to interact and see other people, which is pretty much common sense. The more time you spend outside of your apartment, the more likely you're going to see someone. And how does Fluid kind of play a role in that? How does fluid sociability help with social interactions? So we start with what Fluid actually is. So Fluid is a public good open source project. Essentially, it's a simulation tool that measures how social a building is. So Fluid is actually an acronym for all the factors that can be, all the sociability factors that can be affected by architecture. So Fluid stands for frequency, legibility, uniqueness, intimacy, and duration. And with the simulation software, it produces a lot of data that you can kind of use to compare two different buildings. The research that went into Fluid spans between architecture, social science, and public health. There aren't a lot of studies done, or there aren't a lot of studies available that kind of look at how the built environment affects sociability. A lot of that is kind of what's going on internally that affects sociability and whether or not you choose to talk to someone else. So we've kind of had to piece different studies together from the 3 different areas to kind of build on Fluid. And we also partnered with UBC Psychology, and they're our advisors, and they kind of help us walk us through what would be helpful and useful for the software. So how do we measure sociability in the software? We go through 3 metrics. So we measure encounters, which is just the kind of physical possibility of an interaction happening. Do we see each other? And then we measure greetings and conversations, which is where the actual interaction happens. So a greeting can happen when you pass by someone and you wave to them. And then a conversation happens when you actually stop to talk. These are the parameters that go into route finding in the simulation. So we take into account a lot of different parameters on how people might move and where they might move in the building. So we look at weather. We look at whether it's raining, if it's sunny, is it cold outside, is it too hot? And then we also look at whether a resident would be more likely to take the elevator versus the stairs. How many floors are they going up? Are they going down? And is that individual healthy enough to walk up the stairs? And you're also more likely to kind of take routes that you've taken before. So we take that into account as well and have a memory for each person in the simulation. These are the parameters that we have for calculating whether two people will greet each other. So one of the most important factors that we found through the research is familiarity. The more familiar you are with someone, the more likely you are to talk to them and to greet them. In the simulation or in the simulator, we have 3 levels of familiarity. We have strangers, acquaintances, and well-known. So as you kind of move up through each level, you're more and more likely to talk to someone. And there's that idea that repeated encounters are more useful. And there are also other parameters like the social triangulation, where if 2 people have a dog, they're more likely to talk to each other. And you're also more likely to talk to someone that has a dog as well. Once we get into conversations, the parameters and factors that go into whether a conversation will happen is a lot more speculative on our side, just because there isn't a lot of studies done. And a lot of these are just kind of based on personal experience. So one of the social factors that we looked at was time pressure. If we're doing an activity that has a tight timeline, like if we're going to work in the morning, we might not have time to kind of stop and talk to someone. And then there's also the idea of the semi-private space that serves as that buffer zone. That's a defensible space where it's owned by you, but it's also in the public realm. So you feel safer and more likely to talk to someone maybe passing by your front yard. And then we also take into account whether if it's raining, maybe you're not as likely to talk to someone as well. So this is the user workflow for Fluid. So the user would create a digital model in Revit and then mark that up with the Fluid tags and then export that as an FBX file. We upload that to the Fluid simulator, which is on the cloud, and then we get kind of the results. And how have we used Fluid Sociability so far? This is a case study that we did for the city of Calgary. We looked at one of their affordable housing developments. This one's called Rundle Manor. On the left, we see the existing housing that's now demolished. And it's basically just kind of a townhouse development with the parking lot in front. And then on the right, we see the proposed redevelopment by Stantec and 546 Architects. So looking at the site plan for the two, we can see that it's quite different already. On the left, in the existing housing, we see that essentially there's 2 parking areas that are divided in the site, and then they're surrounded by some townhouses. And there are several garbage areas and 2 mailboxes. And you see that the site is kind of split in the middle. And then when we looked at the proposed redevelopment, you can see that everything's kind of spread throughout the site a lot more, and the distribution of parking is more evenly kind of spaced out. You can't really see in this plan here, but on the ground floor, the parking actually goes through, and you can kind of move through the site that way. Oh, I forgot to say that there are also amenities added into the proposed redevelopment. They have a children's play area in this courtyard, and then they have 2 amenity rooms as well. So Fluid Sociability, the software can also measure where people are moving on the site. And this is especially helpful for this particular site because we can see in the existing one, there's very little movement happening between the 2 townhouse complexes. Because people are just going from the door to the car. In this particular neighborhood in Calgary, it's very car dependent. So people just go from their door to their car, or from their door to the garbage area, or from their door to the mailbox. And they kind of hardly intermingle or hardly interact at all. And then on the right, we see the proposed redevelopment. We see a lot more mixing on the site. And we see that there's a lot more reason for people to move through the site and to kind of use that space a little more efficiently. And these are the results that we got from a 90-day simulation. So on the left, we have the existing housing, and then on the right, we have the proposed redevelopment. The proposed redevelopment actually had a higher density, so we had to kind of hack the system and lower the population to kind of match. So we know that the results that we get aren't because of a higher population. So we see in the results for the existing housing, there is 0.74 encounters per person per day, which means we're seeing about one person every other day. And then in the proposed redevelopment, we're seeing 2.67 encounters per resident per day, which means we're seeing at least 2 people per day. The numbers aren't meant to reflect reality. It's purely meant as a comparison and to give you an idea on how the design is kind of performing. And we never claim to simulate reality, but it's just kind of a useful tool for you to see the potential of the development. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Carmen. Up next, we have Mary Chow, Civic Principal, Sport and Recreation, and Associate Vice President at HDR.
Thank you. I'm just going to get my screen up. 1 second here. Okay. For almost all of my adult life, I held a strong belief that gender equity was a given, that equality is within reach for any woman who wanted it, and instead the more pressing issue of today is the ever more visible presence of gender diverse individuals. And in my own way, I was denying that male and female inequities existed. I grew up in a family where I was expected to achieve as much as my brother. I didn't feel that I was different, and definitely not less. Equality was an underlying core value of my family, and perhaps that's why inequalities around me were not really apparent. For me, equality was invisible. A number of years out of architecture school, this happened to me. My partner and I decided to start a family, and as my career was getting established, something changed once I had my baby. And although I tried as hard as I could to keep life as it was pre-child, I gained some new feelings towards my priorities. I spent the last 17 years focusing on community sport and recreation projects. I believe that in this building type, that it has the power to change lives for the better. For all community members and through physical exercise, these buildings keep people healthy and out of the expensive healthcare systems. Today, the trend towards sport participation equity seems to be moving backwards. 62% of Canadian girls are not participating in any kind of sport. 1 in 3 girls drop out of sport versus 1 in 10 boys. And when we can't keep our girls interested in physical activity, it doesn't actually get better with age. Equity and equality have long been used interchangeably, but the terms are often confused with each other. While the focus of equality is framed with sameness being the end goal, equity may be defined as a state in which all people have fair access to the resources and opportunities necessary to thrive. Gender equity still favors men if consideration of what women really need is not considered. Then it's not really equal, but gender equity isn't just about putting the focus on women. Equity is equally beneficial to men as well as women. As a designer, I strive to build spaces based on genuine insight into the people who will use them. So there is confidence that we deliver real value. And when we build resiliency into the design, we can know that our designs will adapt better to change and be more relevant to the user into the future. Our insight can only be valid if we understand the varying perspectives of those that we're trying to target. If I want to know how to keep teenage girls interested in sport, I need their honest perspectives. We need to listen and understand what they need and what barriers prevent them from participating. We know that we can do better for girls and women. And there are examples of amazing work all over the world, such as Sport England's Go Where Women Are. Sport England created pilot projects which explore women's relevant motivations their barriers and triggers to getting more active, and what this means for sport and exercise initiatives in general. And what we found was that confidence, childcare, and capability are factors that prevent participation. Negative body image, poor perceptions of belonging, feeling unwelcome, reprisal for prioritizing themselves over their families. They drop out of sport and recreation in 120 countries because of fear of judgment in common. In the book Invisible Women, author Caroline Perez examines the overall lack of data on women in the design and planning of spaces. She talks about how room temperature, snow clearing routes, washrooms, active spaces are more often than not based on data collected solely from men. That bias, whether we understand that bias as unconscious or conscious, is the first step to understanding that not all spaces are designed equally. The perspectives from girls and women and how we apply this information can make the difference in changing recreation facilities and increase overall participation. When a teenager lacks confidence and has a fear of judgment of ability, appearance, or prioritizing exercise over their other multiple commitments, we can create for them spaces for semi-private socializing, for connection, even homework space. Bringing girls in gives us the potential to expose them to sport programming in the rest of the facility. When a mother won't enter a recreation facility for herself, we can provide spaces that engage young children. Because women prioritize their family and children over themselves, it may take a play feature to bring them into the building. For that reason, placement of a room is one of the most critical components of a gender equitable design. If we're successful at getting girls and women to come into the facility, we can then introduce them to a wide variety of active programming through visual connection, which not only builds familiarity, curiosity, and social connection, but ultimately provides the greatest potential for healthy outcomes. We look holistically at facility design, and when we ask ourselves, what are women looking for? Our engagement becomes more meaningful. Of new immigrant women at the Edmonds Community Center led directly to the early implementation of a central nursing room, close to but completely separate from public bathrooms and adjacent to other spaces that support mothers. Building design should consider how a new visitor may feel unsure and uncomfortable, that they may feel judged for their abilities. Designs should consider girls that prioritize social gathering, mothers with young children, a need to feel safe and sometimes unseen, or the need to watch and feel comfortable first before participating. Site design should consider environments that make females feel safe. It can be as simple as locating a bus stop near entrances, well-lit parking lots and paths to entrances that are easy to see and therefore to find, playgrounds that are also close to building entrances, and crime prevention through environmental design. Gender equity is good for business. It's good for women, and it's also good for men. In fact, a report from the University of Minnesota has shown that those countries that are more gender equitable score higher on the happiness scale. It is our opportunity to design for equity, and change begins with all of us.
Thank you, Mary. Up next, we have Robin Fenton, Principal Architect and Post-Disaster Liaison from Tectonic Architecture.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully that's working. Yeah. Can you see? Hopefully you're seeing the correct screen.
Can't see your screen yet.
Oh, you can't see it yet. Okay. Is that working?
Yes, it is.
Okay, yes. Thanks, everybody. So welcome. I'm here to talk about architects and their role in post-disaster response. Let me click properly here. Oh, that's not working either. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Robin Fenton. I'm an architect with Tectonic Architecture, and I'm also have the role of AIBC Post-Disaster Liaison. So I trained in post-disaster building assessments in 2013, and that launched the post-disaster committee at the AIBC, which I was a part of from 2014 to 2019. And during that time, I was one of the authors of the post-disaster building assessment framework and recommendation document, which is a big mouthful. And I currently represent the AIBC on the provincial PDBA advisory committee. So first, to understand, if you don't know much about it, emergency management, what is that and what does it look like? So first, mitigation, which many of you might be familiar with, things like Dark Ingles dry line in New York, which was a response to the Superstorm Sandy, things locally like our seismic upgrades for the schools, those kinds of things. So mitigating the damage that will happen during a disaster event. The second phase part of emergency management, preparedness. Lots of us are probably familiar with that. Shakeout BC and 72 hours, having your things ready in your home. The next one is recovery, which probably lots of us are also familiar with. As architects, there's often competitions or there's other things that we're aware of, such as this is the Christchurch Restart Mall that was done fairly quickly after their major earthquake events. And that was really to get businesses started quickly, obviously designed out of shipping containers, and it was a relatively rapid response. Other things like temporary housing after Hurricane Katrina or more rapid response housing. So those are things that we're probably familiar with as architects in terms of emergency management. The other one that you may not be as familiar with is the third one, response, and what role we as architects can play in that direct response. So response happens in the hours, days, and weeks that follow a disaster event. And the main way, and the training that we have and that we're encouraging our members to take part of, is post-disaster building assessments. So the AIA in America has been doing these for about 10 to 20 years, and generally they're done as volunteers, as architects as volunteers. So to understand where this fits in emergency response, when there's a disaster event, then there's the authority having jurisdiction or local government, or essentially we know the municipal authority. They're the ones ultimately responsible for a response to a disaster event. So something like the North Shore, there's a small flooding event, that's the North Shore Emergency Management, they're responding to that. When their capacity is exceeded, so for example, the recent floodings that we had out in Abbotsford, when that community can't respond with their own resources, they reach up to the province, which is Emergency Management BC. Now through BC Housing, who's maintaining a registry and acting as the liaison, that's when they'll contact us as volunteers. So architects, engineers, and other design and building professionals can be on their registry. So you'll be contacted if you're registered for that. So post-disaster building assessments, what are they? There are several different kinds, which you can see here on the screen, but mainly the ones that we would be involved with as volunteers are going to be the rapid ones, so exterior or interior only. Windshield ones are generally performed by the local government, and then the more detailed and engineering ones are in the later phase of response, and those would be ones that we may potentially be asked to perform for our clients, and those would be paid ones as part of our work, not volunteer roles. So deployment kind of looks like this. This was one that I took part in a few years ago, and you'll get asked if you're available. You'll respond and say, yes, I can come out. You'll be given instructions. You'll show up at a place that kind of looks like this. And it's called the Emergency Operations Center. You'll be briefed. You'll be told what you're going to be doing. You'll be put into teams. Generally, a minimum of 2, but often 3 people will go out as a team to assess a number of buildings. And so you'll walk around the property. So this is what we were looking at. There was a flooding event out in the Fraser Valley, and you'll walk the full perimeter of the building, possibly go inside if it's possible. Often it's not. And then as a team, you'll determine it's called posting the building. So you just determine if the building is in fact habitable, which I'll get into in a moment. One of the tools that's been developed over the years is a digital tool, which is fantastic. So as you can see, this was the deployment we were on. As you are screening the buildings, they're showing up as green, yellow, and red. And that information is fed not only to your other teams with their app, but that's also going back to the Emergency Operations Center. So you're rapidly seeing what the state of that neighborhood is. So what did those colors mean? So this is the real work of what we're doing when we're out there assessing these buildings. So they're fairly self-explanatory here. So unsafe, the red ones, that's really a building that's totally unsafe and isn't appropriate for anybody to inhabit until further assessments have been done and likely repairs. And it can also mean a complete demolition, that the building can't be recovered. A green is, we don't call them safe, but we call them inspected. And the reason behind that is, especially if you're on a building this size, you wouldn't be, but especially on a home, if you've just done a rapid assessment, you're just basically saying you haven't seen anything that's made it, you feel it's unsafe. So it's generally, you're saying that people can inhabit it, but it's always recommended that people get further assessments, just depending on the type of event, flooding, windstorm, or earthquake. The ones that are really tricky are the yellow ones. So those are in between. can either be at the low end, which is it is safe to use with certain caveats, like certain parts or certain things, like, for example, this piece of equipment on the roof, the building could be otherwise completely sound, but this particular piece of equipment isn't. So there might be restrictions onto how the people can use that building. And it may vary also to the other end, where the building is quite damaged, but it is safe for people to go in for short periods of time to get their possessions and then get out, but they can't stay in the building. And there's also the concept of habitability, and so it really depends on the extent of the event. If it's a relatively small event, so here we have a home with a damaged chimney. If it's a pretty small event, you might say to people, hey, you probably shouldn't be there, until you get that fixed or demolished or something like that. But if it's a very large event, as was the case, say, in Christchurch, many homes had chimneys that were damaged like this, but there weren't a lot of places for people to go. And so they wanted to encourage people to stay in their homes. So they actually made these yellow cards instead. And so people were able to stay, and they just had to stay away from outside the building or wait for the chimney to sort of be demolished. So there's a sliding scale, and it really depends on the event. And so when you transition, then that's the immediate response. And during the time of transitioning from response to recovery, this is probably what most of us are going to be faced with. So this may in fact be, similar to your office or your client's offices or your client's spaces, and you might be getting calls for this. So that was speaking about the volunteer roles and the role the AIBC is training people for in the Registry of BC Housing. This is actually perhaps what most of us will face as architects in terms of post-disaster response. So there's going to be all sorts of detailed assessments, engineering assessments that are going to need to be done on lots of buildings if it is a major region-wide event, which of course we're somewhat expecting in Vancouver. And so yeah, this is what we will likely have to respond to and help our clients with. And a lot of it is, as you can see, it's non-structural debris. That really is a bigger issue. As an example, just to show you how that green, yellow, and red shakes out, and they use yellow or orange as well in this map. This is Christchurch 2011. So you can see it's roughly maybe half of them are green, and another, say, 40% are the yellow, and orange is slightly more damaged, yellow is slightly less. And then the red, which you can see is a small amount, are the ones that are uninhabitable or total collapse. In a typical response, it's the vast majority are green. So when you're assessing lots and lots of homes, lots of them are green, and it's a smaller amount that are yellow and red. Very quickly, I cannot describe the professional liability issues in 20 seconds, but certainly the AIBC is on it. We are aware of these. We're actually working with the provincial government along with EGBC. We've been working collaboratively since 2017 to provide the government feedback on liability coverage for registered professionals. And it is something that's ongoing, and happy to answer questions about that if people want to know more. And so more resources, the BC Post-Disaster Building Assessment Framework and Recommendation document, as well as the Post-Disaster Building Assessment Guideline for Communities. Those are available on the BC Housing website. So if you simply Google BC Housing Post-Disaster, it comes up right away. And of course, AIBC, we do run a training event once a year, which has just happened, but we had a very big wait list. So we are looking at running another one in the fall. So if you are interested, get in touch. And if you have any more questions for me, please feel free to get in touch with me, postdisaster@aibc.ca. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Up next, we have Miyuchi Young, undergraduate architecture student at UBC.
Hi everyone, my name is Miyuchi Young. I'm a second year in the Bachelor of Design program at UBC Sala. I'm also part of Noma, which is the National Organization of Minority Architects. And this is actually our competition submission for the Barbara G. Laurie Student Design Competition held annually at the Noma National Conference. So I'm part of the student chapter at UBC that advocates for diversity in design education and to create discussions in regards to equity within the educational and professional architectural field. So the competition format gave our team of 6 an opportunity to engage with architecture in other parts of the world, as well as with other minority design students. We took on the challenge of designing the Noma Legacy Headquarters and Resource Campus, which is essentially a community with Noma at the center of it all. Some design considerations included honoring the history and culture of Black Detroiters, as well as reimagining public spaces that also consider affordable multi-generational housing, educational resources, and design practices. So with the online format, it responded to sort of the situation with the pandemic and various movements, which have always changed the way that we design, build, and live. being only first-year students, it was essential that we reached out to design professionals and had the enriching opportunity to learn from mentors from all around the world through the online format. So unlike school projects, the competition was a chance for us to really delve deep into the site and its context. It's a self-initiated exploration of the built environment and also on how we can do our best to address challenges of the marginalized community and respond thoughtfully to the given design considerations. So to provide some background context, the site is located in Brush Park within Detroit. And historically, this neighborhood has struggled with residential discrimination following the decline of the Rooster housing projects and also led to the displacement of Black Detroiters, which further strained employment opportunities and fragmented the community. So the site itself is located adjacent to the Fisher Freeway. It's a little sunken freeway there. And so our final project responds to recent developments in the area and includes programming for mixed-use housing, retail units, as well as community center in order to address the empty and disconnected nature of Brush Park neighborhood. So as a student, we felt like the biggest change in architecture starts at the educational level, and becoming part of this next generation of designers, we identified that empowering young people to affect change in the community through the design was crucial and also reflected in the Noma organization's Project Pipeline initiative, which is essentially education for children that fosters that next generation of design professionals. So essentially, just like this competition, accountability in design starts at an early age in terms of connecting young people to real world architects and planners. And it's important to create this environment that fosters this connection in our final design. So some questions we kind of look back to was, who is this design for? What is the design problem, as well as how will this be used? And we tried our best to make sure that this site reinforces education in all forms, be it through the workspaces, the garden spaces, classrooms, et cetera. And so that youth can really see the rest of the site with our final form. Looking at the site adjacencies, we really tried to decipher for ourselves what this reimagined public space looked like. And so being a designated urban mixed-use neighborhood, we really zoomed in on focusing on opportunities for growth, as well as an emphasis on locality. And our site aimed to be a means to bring people together through positive public space, since learning, as we deciphered, comes from other people. An organic form throughout the site became a means of ensuring that no back is turned onto the community, as prevalent in the massing sketches here, as well, and made sure that everyone was welcome, and that was entrances from all sides. Improved walkability throughout the site provides opportunities for people and ideas to meet. It's important that there was multimodal access, as this community was designed not just for those in the Brush Park neighborhood, but for also the greater Detroit area. Wrapping it all together is an all-encompassing platform that will be utilized as opportunities for people to really make it their own. So with growth being perceived visually as an upwards motion, our site's form provides an elevated perspective and figuratively gestures towards that growth on a local scale through its live, work, play, and sustain opportunities. The circular design promotes a very non-hierarchical environment. The atrium at the center of the Noma headquarters unifies programming with spaces for local events and gatherings, while also opening up opportunities for organic connections to thrive. There's incubator spaces for startups within the Noma Center, as well as an open kitchen on the second level of Noma Center that opens up to the patio. Designed with multi-generational housing in mind, there are open terraces on upper levels for close proximity to open green space, as well as connecting doors between select studio units that accommodate for multi-generational housing while also maintaining private space. With Detroit currently ranking last in acres of park space, our site includes green spaces such as through these platforms, residential terraces, and townhouse courtyard. And so these vertical gardens mitigate noise as well as CO2 absorbance throughout the site, especially being located right next to the freeway. And in terms of going back to educate, these project pipeline classrooms throughout the site and workshops on the ground floor create ease between navigating the spaces. As youth progress through the programming, they're able to explore the built environment, connect with their community, and grasp lifelong tools for success by helping elevate their perspective of youth and envisioning their futures. Looking at our programming as a whole, we emphasize the interdisciplinary and universal aspect of learning, how having headquarters at the center of our project helps to drive the programming forward, with the platform as an extension of the headquarters throughout the site, weaving through the spaces where people live, work, and play. Finally, empower. The economic and cultural hub of D-Town empowers different communities to come together, pursue their dreams, and help both each other and the Brush Park neighborhood grow. The final rendition of the reimagined community centralizes education, employment, and affordable housing to catalyze equitable urban growth, spatial agency for marginalized communities, as well as lifelong access to conducive educational environments with Noma at the center of it all. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Miucci. Up next, we have Melanie Robertson, Senior Project Manager with Bim Academy. Now, Melanie's joining us from the UK, so she sent a recording in advance that we'll play for you now.
Hello everyone, and thank you to Women in Architecture for giving me the opportunity to present today at your March event. I'm sorry I can't be presenting live to you today. I'm currently 4,500 miles away, but I hope you're all having a great time listening to the presentations lined up for you today. So who am I? Well, my name is Dr. Melanie Robertson, and I am a Senior Project Manager with Bim Academy. I specialise in all things BIM and information management, with an emphasis on the ISO 19650 suite of international standards. I lead on the implementation of digital strategies for the public sector in Scotland, as well as key international projects in Canada and Greece. I love BIM so much, I went and got myself a PhD in it. My research looked into the perceived relationship between the macro diffusion of BIM in the UK, brought about by our governmental mandates, and the micro behaviours of individuals. That is how we as industry practitioners understood and assimilated BIM into our working lives. But what do I do now? Well, Bim Academy is an award-winning centre of excellence for digital engineering and have been operating globally for the past 11 years. We are co-owned by Ryder Architecture, who have offices globally, including in Vancouver, Newcastle upon Tyne in the UK, Amsterdam and Hong Kong, and Northumbria University in the northeast of England. We have 4 key strands to the business. We develop digital strategies for our clients to help them fully embrace their digital information, deliver learning and development across industry and within academia, support live projects in an information management capacity, and finally, we do research, which looks at innovation with a growing emphasis on digital twins. Whenever we start a project with a client, we like to remind ourselves of what BIM is and the vision for its implementation. What we need to remember is that BIM is a digital process, which provides information and data which is coordinated among all in the delivery team throughout all phases of the project. BIM is not just about the capital phase, but arguably most crucial during operation. With the internationalization of the BIM standards, we can argue that BIM is less about the modeling and more about better information management, with a renewed emphasis on the information element. The Pechakucha today is focused on accountability, and in my view, that relies extremely heavily on clients receiving information which is auditable, valid, and reliable. We need to ensure our information is well organized and searchable. To do this, we need to make sure our data is speaking a common language between all in the delivery team, but we have a common data environment where we can share information using naming protocols, permissions, and status codes. Ultimately, we need to make sure our data is representing a single source of truth. When I am first put in the room with the client, I like to show them this diagram because I think it perfectly encapsulates why setting out their information requirements as early as possible is critical to a project's success. At the end of the day, the client is responsible for setting these out clearly and concisely, so we don't end up with varying interpretations of a tyre swing when all they wanted was, well, a tyre swing. To do this, we need the client to set out what information they need to run their building with varying levels of prescription from client to client. The delivery team, in turn, provides us with a BIM execution plan, which states how this information is to be produced and delivered exactly, providing us, as the information managers, criteria by which to audit and validate the deliverables. This is all set out within the ISO 19650 suite of standards, which were developed from the UK's BIM Level 2 discourse. These international standards emphasise the value of information management, which uses BIM as a delivery vehicle for undertaking this process. The current standards are on screen now, with number 4 incoming shortly. With the implementation of the standards, it is envisaged that every country will adopt its own national annex, which prescribes a greater level of detail based on best practice within that region. As an example, the UK National Annex prescribes a naming convention and a series of metadata such as how revision status code should be assigned and that we must use Uniclass 2015 as a minimum for classifying our BIM objects. We also rely heavily on the COBie schema, which is set out on the screen. For those that are not familiar with COBie, it can seem a bit abstract, but if we break it down, it is simply a hierarchy of data, which means which asset is based in which area of the building. For example, I can assign parameters to my BIM objects. It means I know that the fire extinguisher 12A belongs in room 24C01 on level 1 in building X. The idea is that COBie is the vehicle by which we deliver the non-graphical information from the BIM into the client's own systems. Okay, but why am I, a UK-centric person, so excited to be presenting at a Canadian event? Well, I am currently managing the BIM implementation on the new Surrey Hospital and Cancer Centre in British Columbia. We are working with the client, Fraser Health Authority, to clearly set out their information requirements using UK best practice and the ISO 19650 suite of standards. We have applied the standards to a variety of contexts, one of the most interesting being Hellas Gold, a copper and gold mining company in Athens, Greece. This is because mining has a wide array of assets, from buildings and infrastructure to static and mobile plant and equipment. We developed a digital information management strategy and designed a proof of concept to demonstrate how this can be used in operation. Finally, closer to home, or my home, we are working really closely with a national contractor, Morrison Construction, on the information management of several schools and even a prison within Scotland. I not only work with clients, but also support delivery teams on the ground per se, to ensure that they are actually delivering the information in accordance with the client's requirements. One of the key deliverables for us is an audit report, which clearly outlines the compliances and non-compliances found in the workflows. We audit BIM models, COBie data, and information containers held within the common data environment to produce a comprehensive report. We work with the teams to ensure progress is being made and that they are being held accountable to what is being produced. The key to good information management is that it sets the foundations for really clever applications and can lead to better decision making surrounding how buildings are managed. For example, this can include comfort and well-being, utilization metrics, and fire safety. However, it all relies on good quality information, and boiling it down to knowing which asset is in which space is a critical start to this journey. Along the way, we have picked up several lessons learned. Having a global perspective across different public and private sectors has really emphasized that every digital transformation journey needs to begin with the why. We're also starting to see wider applications of BIM, such as in gold mining and infrastructure, as well as a shift from technology-centric to a more holistic view of information management. Finally, I just want to reiterate my thanks for being invited to the event, and I hope you have taken something away from my short presentation. I truly believe information management is doing wonders for the industry and holding all parties accountable in producing good quality information that not only allows for the efficient delivery of a project, but allows clients to make better decisions well into operation.
Thank you to Melanie. And we have our final presenter up next. We have Kate Robertson, architect and registered heritage consultant at Ryder Architecture.
Let me try this again with my mic on. Can everyone see it? Perfect. So it's I'm at the tail end of so many remarkable people. I don't know what to say. Anyway, so I'm an unlikely person to become an architect. I don't really walk the line too well, and I tend to ask inconvenient questions at inconvenient times. And I've taken a pretty long, winding road to the path of practice. Through many stops in different places and different people at different offices for different reasons. So it gave me a pretty broad perspective on practice and going into it to really focus on what matters to people and why and how. And so when I'm faced with that and looking at consideration, what it gave me is a realization that what we talk about in practice and what we do don't always align. But overall, consistently across the board, doesn't matter you talk to an architect, an engineer, planner, dentist, grocery worker, anybody, is a desire to do better. And I think that's really important as a reminder for myself regularly when I'm in practice, to always strive for that, particularly women in practice, but everyone in practice, to really understand the fulsome nature of what architecture can mean. So when we look at this in a project, particularly in social housing, but this is pretty standard across most projects, is the typical baseline project content, where you have design guidelines, parking, RFP, your budget, accessibility, cost escalations, all this noise coming in, of all these things that we all have to read and digest. And that's the typical baseline project content. What, however, is not collected and data that is not covered is the still tiny small voice that runs in the background of my head all the time saying, is this the right thing to do? And are we asking the right questions? So when I teach, I started that habit when I was a graduate student. It's just carried on forevermore. And I ask these questions to any student, any core consultation group, as a starter, as a primer, to say, oh, what do people want and expect in the future for themselves? And what I can tell you across from an anecdotal perspective, I am not Angus Reid, but what I can tell you is that it's dead consistent. It doesn't really matter who you ask. It doesn't really matter where you are. Is this idea of social housing and community-based housing in North America, at the very least, has some pretty intense belief that we should do what we need to do and do these things for community and for sustainability and social responsibility. But the question comes down to, if anyone's given the option to do this, to live in social and community-based housing, the answer is a very small yes, followed by some hesitant maybes and a large group of people going, absolutely not, that's not for me. So when we're peeling back the layer of this kind of consideration, we look at different kinds of things about why that might be. And when you're looking at certain things, it really is subject to where you are in context of the world as a whole. So in North America and the UK, these are the associations people have with social housing, which is very unfortunate. And it comes out of a notion, as my friend in Minneapolis puts it, is the notion of punishing poor people and saying, well, it's their fault that things haven't worked out. And really the quality of the person may be less and they should just suck it up and deal. And the truth of the matter is these are regular people in communities who have children, and they may be a lower income, and they may be having to work something out, or are just trying to get on with their lives. So when you're in North America and the UK, the associations are poverty, poor conditions, frequently overcrowding, and sort of an unsafe environment. But this is the twist on this. When you take it to Southeast Asia and continental Europe, frequently the notion and association is with upward mobility, a common experience, because more people rent than own, safety, and there is just a larger perspective for social comfort in that sense. So when you're doing this, what it really tells me a lot in my practice and having these conversations is the lived experience of space is what makes the difference. And that legacy carries through to the language of place and space, and what we associate as home, what we associate as good, what we associate as better, and all these kinds of sort of key components that are set to discussing social housing. Now, I'm not saying all social housing is bad. It really isn't. And there's a lot of extraordinary work. Pritzker Prize winners do social housing. Wonderful people in Canadian architects, publishing Canadian architects do social housing. Others are some great firms in Spain and Los Angeles and all over the place. If you're going to go look for something good, you can find it if you look. So then you sort of pose the question of, well, what is our story here, and why is this such an issue? So fear of otherness and fear of too much are the same. So when we talk with people about this, there is this notion of two factors: either the fear of people coming into the community and being scary, dangerous, questionable, you don't know who they are. And this, or too much of the same, of repetitive, restrictive, limited housing that doesn't really serve the purpose of who you are as a person or what you're trying to do. Again, talking about lived experience. Now, when you're talking about this all comes out to a large extent about our language as architects and how we really approach this. And when you're getting into the fear of this, homogeneity and car dependence are historically huge factors. And really, whether it is that you live in an dense development like you see on the left of 6-story, 10-story buildings, or you deal with developments on the right of low rise or very low density suburban housing with these tracts, the same issues come up, which is homogeneity of population. And that comes out of the fact that certain people can afford to live in any of these places, and developers and different groups really are trying to expand their footprint in any building, generally speaking, whenever they purchase land, because it's expensive. And there's all the infrastructure of stairs and elevators and ramps and the code and all these things. And I am not saying in any way, shape, or form that we should delete fire trucks out of our life. They're important. I understand the purpose. It's really valid to ask for that as a requirement. But I guess the question when you're talking about this is it does set a baseline of who can be there and who that language of place is going to be catering to, because they have to offload those expenses from larger structures to more units. Therefore, they want more units per building. They want more building on the site than they ever would before, causing these conditions that may not be ideal. Social housing definitely suffers from the same thing. It is not unique in that regard. So when you're talking about outdoor space and all the pieces in between, whether you're talking about the notion of the reinvention of the superblock in Spain, which is a really popular conversation right now, or whether you're talking about Jane Jacobs' open grid system with the open neighborhood, the issue still remains the same. And that's how do we create a positive, great relationship between building, place, and the surrounding space in an urban or moderate context. So when we're talking about that, also we're talking about the protections of safety and resources for children. This is a big topic. Moms want to go back to work. They can't go back to work because they don't have that access. We have the federal government talking about child care grants and all sorts of things, and a lot of child care. We do a lot of child care in our office to talk about giving people the opportunity for being active in the community and active within the economy. So when we're talking about this, these perceptions of safety really matter. So when we talk about the idea of comparisons of the types of buildings developments we do, courtyards really do matter. Those sort of extra spaces that don't fill out the lot to make spaces available for children, to make spaces for families and community to be able to access that is really, really important. And when you're in a suburban context, you have your backyard. And that's great. When you get into a higher density situation, what frequently tends to happen is these things get pushed off the table. And the building keeps getting bigger and the site keeps feeling like it's getting smaller, and you end up without that kind of access. The other piece in this is the stigma within a community. So when you're talking about social housing, as I said, there's some pretty pejorative commentary about this that I have heard, unfortunately, and the idea of NIMBYism and the sort of like, who are they and why are they here and why can't they afford a house and why can't they do what we do? I can do that, why can't they? And the issue is I think that you frequently have to take a step back to remember that you have to come where other people are at in terms of how they're functioning in the world. And when we teach, we see that all the time, right? When you're teaching a student, you always have this notion of saying, I'm going to meet you halfway. I understand that you have to do a certain amount of content, and my job is to help you get there. And frequently we sort of underrate the value of social communication within public consultation. I'm sure that since 2020, we all haven't done it because of COVID, but we all have been to these events. They can be rather rancorous and they can be rather aggressive, and people can be pretty darn frightened. And the question is how do you speak the language to work towards coming to a commonality, to say that although they may be different from me and how I live, that doesn't make it less, it doesn't make it wrong, and it doesn't make me better or worse either. So the removal of judgment, I think, really is an important factor to really consider in social housing. So then you sort of take a step back in this macro thing of, so how big is an issue is this anyway? Well, Arthur Erickson made a statement back in 1985-ish into an article in a newspaper talking about the idea how Vancouver and the metropolitan area of Metro Vancouver and the whole southwestern part of BC should really be considering what it is to develop a 10 million person city. And when you talk about that, this map sort of makes a lot more sense, and how that's going to work to conserve some pretty valuable assets. So this is an abstracted map to understand the boundary between Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley Regional District. At least the Fraser Valley portion of it is actually quite large, but it goes up into the mountains. And what you notice here is the sort of pinky grayed out areas are mountains, which equals a slope grade of approximately more than 12%. They still get pretty steep. We are in a very specific state of grace by living in this sort of lower level comfortable zone. The green represents the ALR. And these are important lands to feed us, to conserve, to provide environmental services, to all these things, and to basically make our lives as functional as they are. The white area represents really the urban kind of areas and suburban areas surrounded in all the different metropolitan regions across the lower mainland. And what's really interesting about it is you do see how much density and how much land has truly been consumed by people in Metro Vancouver, and how that area of expansion has really been tapped out in a visual terms. But on the flip side of that, what you see in the Fraser Valley Regional District is these spaces are limited and much more restricted because they are hemmed in by many other environmental factors that are much more aggressive. The mountains are tighter, the valley narrows, the river gets faster and wider, and the ALR takes up a lot more space. So when you're looking at the population increase under StatsCan, it really does tell the tale. And what if you were to develop a sort of fascination for this as I have, is you actually see that Vancouver's starting to level out in a certain way. And the Fraser Valley, although it has regional district is smaller in terms of numbers by a large amount, you're really looking at a population increase percentage that's much more drastic. Now, I will bet serious lunch money that when we get the census data out of the post-COVID period, we are going to find those numbers shift. We know and hear in the news constantly that people are leaving Vancouver, leaving the metro because it is unaffordable and it is unachievable because of the cost of living. Cost of housing is absolutely monstrous, one of the highest in the world, as we know. And so we come back to this issue again of social housing, because in a situation where people cannot afford to purchase, cannot afford to buy, rental really is the only option available, and stable, safe, consistent rental housing really, really is important. So when you take a project like we are looking at assessing a site, so we amazingly enough have a site that is relatively flat in a jurisdiction in the Lower Mainland, and it is pretty clear of many impediments. There's really not much there. And the question is, well, how many masses can you create? So we started an exercise in our office about the idea, well, how many could you do? And you say, well, because there's some of the standard forms like the sort of the eye, the hammerhead, and the rod, and these sort of linear shapes. And then you start getting into some more interesting and adventurous sizes and shapes and forms. And the answer is an awful lot is what you can find out in terms of shapes and forms. And then you start really looking and reflecting on these peripheral conditions again of what added values you can bring to the site that are important to supporting the community and the carrying capacity of what you're bringing all these people onto the site to do. So out of over 100 sketches, 68 plus options all met the primary project objectives of certain number of units, certain number of density, certain amount of areas of square footage for amenity, indoor, and different kinds of things. But what the really valuable thing about this exercise is that you see that all the pieces about the exterior form and language of these buildings starts to change quite drastically. So then you're going to have to go through, like we do, I'm sure, the concept of massing options and matrices to really understand what you do when you test drive that in terms of your proforma, your model, GFA, your building composition, the efficiencies, because we are in step code 4 and our office practices passive house standards as a general rule for all our buildings, and we try to engage and get as high as we can on that podium. But the other key component that we're looking at very intently is the livability index for a typical floor. And what's so fascinating about the exercise we went through after all this was said and done was we have the standard sort of options and forms that you see highlighted in green, but the one that was the outlier, and actually the one that was actually the most popular, was a building that actually took on a carrying capacity of an extra 50% more units. Because of the way we looked at the form creatively to try and address a lot of the different components of what it is to dwell in place and how do you create units out of a standardized system and modular kind of question. So when you're doing that, that's awesome and great when we're looking at flat sites. But what I can say is these are the most common challenges we are going to reach. If we are going to be extending and having that density population shifting east, the questions of challenges of environmental and geographic conditions really do become much more prominent, and how social housing will deal with that, and we deal with that as designers and architects and engineers, becomes even more pressed, because whenever we get into unusual things that are not rectilinear and not on the flat, tend to get more expensive. So if you already have an issue with housing being a cost effectiveness issue to make bigger and bigger buildings, you put it on a hill, you're going to be causing an extreme increase in your budget simply because of the mechanics of keeping things from sliding down a hill. So slope grades become a real issue of social housing that are questions. I never thought, except when I'm using and printing drawings late in the evening for something, of the notion of flooding or living on an island. However, I was faced with this year because of the flooding in the Fraser Valley. I live in Abbotsford, and I was on an island for almost 30 days with limited access to a lot of resources as a result of it. And what you realize is the substantial risk that a lot of people who were on the prairie and where development will occur in floodplains and other zones which are limited or questionable that may be affected by expansions of a river like the Nutsack River flooding as it did, or the expansion of climate change and water rising and backing up into these river basins because the ocean is rising due to climate change, can become really serious factors. And again, this does promote the idea of, well, how do you reconcile a raised building with accessibility? How do you reconcile the issue of cost and stability and seismic applications? And of course, then we look at the last aspect, which is fire. Now, I talked to an elder up in Lytton, and they said that it wasn't just the fact, the fire and the fear of them having their homes burned down that was an awe-inspiring event. It was standing shoulder to shoulder with a person on the other side of the river watching their house burn. That fire burned hot and it burned deep. It melted infrastructure well 5 feet below grade. And there is nothing left. And we see this in the news. There is a monstrous cleanup involved in Lytton, but also Fort McMurray and other centers which are looking at these kinds of risks that we may not immediately have within our current footprint as metropolitan areas in the Fraser Valley. We start creeping up into the mountains, we start creeping up into other places and expand across the landscape. We will have these questions that we need to ask. So I guess the question, the last slide I have here is, well, how does all this theory, anecdote, experiment, policy, and politics apply in the areas of expansion? And I guess the 4 takeaways that I can sort of take from this would be that there is a question in practice about what we decide to do with our projects. We are the people who control this to a certain extent. And yes, there are RFPs, but the advocacy aspects, whether it is to do with equity, accessibility, form, meaning, space and place, and all that content is really in our hands. And that responsibility we have is awe-inspiring and shocking, but it's also a little bit overwhelming. You can also say that the perspective, your perspective matters. Remember that half the world is either women or gender neutral or non-binary. There are many people who speak this place and language, and therefore that voice should be heard across all buildings. And the last piece, I guess, I would take away from that would be that peripheral content matters. Juhani Posma talks about it in his book, The Eyes of the Skin. The idea that form and space should be affected by, be viewed with a peripheral view to understand the holistic parts of us all and how we live. And to remember that on average, it takes 3 to 6 tries to get something right. So if you're going to persist in this and persist with clients, please do, because if you persist, we all persist, then we all end up making a better place. So thank you so much for your time.
thank you, Kate. That was a great presentation to wrap us all up. I will turn the floor over to Jessica, who will help us finish off the evening with a short Q&A session.
All right, thank you, everybody. That was lots of really inspiring and really thought-provoking topics were brought up. Thank you to all the speakers. So we don't have a ton of time left. So I'm just going to scale down our question period to one question, but open it up to everyone. I think this is like a kind of an interesting, quite a broad question that everyone's kind of touched on in some way. So the question was posed specifically for Mary. What would you say is the or a major factor to consider when designing with the idea of adapting to change in mind? So I think lots of people have touched on this. Mary, if you want to start.
Yeah, sure. This is I saw the question come up in the Q&A, and I have to say, this is a really difficult question. And if I had the one answer to this, I could probably write a book and I wouldn't be in architecture. And I think that this actually applies in so many different ways. I would have to say that when I look back into a lot of projects that actually have anticipated for change and have sort of accommodated change, whether it be programming or where the community is going, a lot of it is being really open to rethinking something that you're doing, right? So how many times does someone, on this call say, well, I'm doing another building of a similar type. Here's all of the typical details. I'm pulling everything in. This is what I'm going to do. It makes me more money. It's fast. My staff doesn't have to rethink everything. But it's really that upfront consideration of rethinking something and understanding where you're not meeting the community need or the client need in some way. So an example that I can tell you is we worked on a project in Coquitlam, the Poirier Sport and Leisure Center, and we designed one rink that was programmed for curlers to actually expand into an NHL size for children, hockey practice, and so forth. Never in my lifetime did I ever think that that would ever change, because the curlers was such a strong group there. But lo and behold, 10 years later, and just recently, we converted that rink. And so we had to pre-plan for it. So a lot of it is just really rethinking something that a client or is not quite working well, and providing the space, the opportunity for that change to happen. And I'm sure there's a ton of other great examples too.
Great, thanks. Autumn, do you have anything to add to that?
I saw a lot of questions for me in there. I can answer some of the questions that were there. So one of the questions was about the net zero not reachable for schools. What I meant by that was it all comes down to money, and it comes down to if the payback and energy savings. The question was about net zero. Sorry, why wasn't net zero actually achievable at Tattaloo? And the answer is we had to put in a series of these measures like triple paned fiberglass windows and some kind of like screw, like a stainless steel screw to fix the cladding to it to help with the thermal bridging. Those all cost a lot of money upfront capital wise, and the money that we would save in energy savings didn't pay for them, if that makes sense, over a 40-year period. And so the ministry is always about money. So that's why that didn't work out. I saw another question about the architectural firms, about the scope, and can you speak to how your role in the capital projects interfaces with architectural offices? What is your scope and the scope of the design firms? Essentially, I'm the client. So I'm the bridge between the Ministry of Education and the architects. So I retain architects to actually design the buildings, and they report to me, and then I report to the ministry. And I saw another question about, do you see the recent experiences with remote learning due to COVID influencing any design and planning parameters in school? No. The Ministry of Education has their area standards that were developed in 2012, and that is what that's what we have to design to, unfortunately. And it's all about money in the end.
I actually, when I saw that question, I was thinking, Carmen, about your work with social interactions. Has COVID affected the Fluid tool at all?
It's affected our validation process a lot. When we kind of researched and added in our parameters, we were thinking of kind of pre-COVID or post-COVID behavior. So we faced a lot of challenges getting the kind of validation process started because people are a lot more wary of social interaction. There's a lot more distance kind of in between people now. But we've also kind of talked about how behavior of agents, the behavior of people have been changing after COVID and how that might affect the simulation as well.
Yeah, it would certainly be interesting to see how it's affected and whether the results line up. Carmen, there was one other question for you about what is your background that has gotten you into this kind of research, or what kind of skills help you do that?
Sure. I graduated from the environmental design program at UBC Sala back in 2020. And then I took a few gap years to work at Human Studios and work on Fluid. And then I am looking to do my master's, but I just had my bachelor in environmental design.
Great, thank you. And then there was actually one, I think maybe this will be a final question since we're already a little bit over, but there's one question to Kate about how you think something like the Fluid simulator might affect your work, and kind of that concept of like people wanting to live in social environments, but also being resistant to it.
Yeah, I think that there is huge futures in AI and computational math to understand that. We've actually tested Fluid in our office on a project. So we are, yes, I know, Carmen, there you go. We're a user. We're trying it out to see how it goes. But what I think that there is a lot to be said for the notion of understanding how the parameters of computational math parameter infrastructure really sits. Because there is so much variation with people. The one thing I can say about talking to a lot of folks is the more you talk to them, the more you realize that the world is full of fascinating people, but also a huge range of experience. And so I think that it's a good preliminary testing tool that we could definitely use. And as it expands and as the scope of it expands in process, that is very exciting to me. Historically speaking, urban design, and when you're talking about the touchy-feely business around people, places, and spaces, it's very vague and it's very hard to quantify. There's lots of research. You can go on high-rise depression functions, research on isolation because of the marvelous invention of the fob and the lack of interaction in high-rises and towers, and that geometry and physical form can be quite challenging. But I do think that there would be some fascinating ideas about combining both the technical content of AI with social interaction and live feedback across in a really rigorous way to, one, see if it plays out, which I think is really interesting, and two, to see what we can do to make this the most thoughtful and useful places that we can, and to do it with the spirit of good intentions and kindness is, I think, the way to go. So yeah. I think it's got a lot of promise.
Right. Yeah, sorry, we didn't have a lot of time left for questions, but I think it was well traded off for all those presentations. So I think we'll hand it back to Emily for closing out.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming and sharing your evening with us. Thank you to all of the presenters who put their hand up and said, would love to share what it is we're doing. Thank you to all the volunteers. And for AIBC Learning Units, please put your name and AIBC number in the chat. The recording will be up on our website in the near future as a resource. And to save the date, April 21st, we have the petite architect Design for Kids coming and doing a presentation with us. So with that, thank you. Have a nice evening, and we'll see you next time.